Hello and good day. How's your day going? I really hope it's going well. If not, please feel free to talk with me about it. In this first segment, I'll be doing something a little bit shitty. Before we get right into the question, while I was researching trying to pull the pieces of my life together, I stumbled upon this article on Mark Manson's blog. Mark is one of my favorite writers actually. Even though his writings are counterintuitive, they really had a lot of influence on my life. But this particular article was none of his work. It was written by David Foster Wallace, an American writer who has greatly affected my life with his style of writing, and I'm going to read it to you exactly the way it is written. This is water. David Foster Wallace's famous commencement speech about education and finding meaning in everyday life. The following post was not written by me. It was written by David Foster Wallace, one of my favorite writers, and delivered as a commencement speech in 2005 to Kenyon College. The advice within it is simple but poignant and beautiful. It had a massive influence on my life, and for me it sets both the standard and the tone of all of the work I try to do on this site. Sit back and enjoy. Greetings, parents, and congratulations to Kenyon graduating class of 2005. There are these two fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nodded at them and said, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of US commencement speech, the deployment of didactic little parablish story. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshit convention of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise old fish explaining what water is to you, younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish. The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious important reality are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about, stated as an English sentence. Of course, this is just a banal platitude, but the fact is that in the day-to-day trench of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance. Also, I wish to suggest to you on this dry and lovely morning. Of course, the main requirement of speeches like this is that I'm supposed to talk about your liberal art education meaning, to try to explain why the degree you are about to receive has actual human value instead of just material payoff. So let's talk about the single most pervasive clique in the commencement speech genre, which is that a liberal art education is not so much about filling you up with knowledge as it's about teaching you how to think. If you're like me as a student, you've never liked hearing this, and you tend to feel a bit insulted by the claim that you needed anybody to teach you how to think. Since the fact that you even got admitted to a college, this good seems like proof that you already know how to think. But I'm going to posit to you that the liberal art clique turns out not to be insulting at all, because the really significant education in thinking that we are supposed to get in a place like this isn't really about the capacity to think, but rather about the choice of what to think about. If your total freedom of choice regarding what to think about seems too obvious to waste time discussing, I'd like you to think about fish and water. To bracket for just a few minutes your skepticism about the value of a totally obvious. Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other is an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after the fourth beer. And the atheist says, "Look, it's not like I don't have actual reason for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from the camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost and I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below, and so I tried it. I fell to my knee in the snow and cried out, "Oh God, if there is a God, I am lost in this blizzard and I'm gonna die if you don't help me." And now, in the bar, the religious guy looked at the atheist all puzzled. "Well then, you must believe now," he said. "After all, here you are alive." The atheist just rolled his eyes. "No man, all that was a couple of Eskimo happened to come wandering by and show me the way back to camp." It's easy to run this story through kind of a standard liberal art analysis. The exact same story can mean two different things. The exact same story can mean two different things to two different people, giving those people two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, now here, in our liberal art analysis, do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true and the other guy's is false or bad? Which is fine, except we all never end up talking about just where these individuals' template and belief come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys, as if a person's most basic orientation towards the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow just hardwired like height and shoe size, or automatically absorbed from the culture like language, as if how we construct meaning were not actually a matter of personal intentional choice. Plus, there's a whole matter of arrogance. The non-religious guy is so totally certain in his dismissal of a possibility that the passing Eskimo has anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seems arrogant and certain of their own interpretation too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us. But religious dogmatist problem is exactly the same as the story unbeliever. Blind certainty and close-mindedness that amount to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he is locked up. The point here is that I think this is one part of what teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean. To be just a little less arrogant, to have just a little critical awareness about myself and my certainties. Because a huge percentage of the stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and deluded. I have learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduate will too. Here's just one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid, and important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive. But it's pretty much the same for all of us. It is our default settings, hardwired into our board at birth. Think about it. There is no experience you have heard that you are not the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV, on your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, and real. Please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtue. This is not a matter of virtue. It is a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering and getting free of my natural hardwired default settings, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered, to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default settings this way are often described as being well adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic settings here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default settings involve actual knowledge or intellect. These questions get very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract argument inside my head, instead of simply paying attention to what is going on right in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside of me. As I'm sure you guys know by now, it is extremely difficult to stay alert and attentive instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside your own head. 20 years after my graduation, I have come gradually to understand that the liberal arts clique about teaching you how to think is actually shorthand for a much deeper, more serious idea. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. Think of the old clique about the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliques, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually express a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms almost always shoot themselves in the head. They shoot the terrible master. And the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going from your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out. That may sound like hyperbole or abstract nonsense. Let's get concrete. The plain fact is that you graduating senior do not yet have any clue what day in, day out really mean. There happen to be a whole large part of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. By way of example, let's say it's an average adult life and you get up in the morning, go to your challenging white-collar college graduate job, and you work hard for 8 or 10 hours. And at the end of the day, you're tired and somewhat stressed. All you want is to go home and have a good supper and maybe unwind for an hour and then hit the sack early. Because, of course, you have to get up the next day and do it all again. But then, you remember there's no food at home. You haven't had time to shop this week because of your challenging job. And so now, after work, you have to get in your car and drive to the supermarket. It's the end of the work day and the traffic is apt to be very bad. So getting to the store takes way longer than it should. And then You finally get there. The supermarket is very crowded because, of course, it's the time of the day when all the other people with jobs also try to squeeze in some grocery shopping. And the store is hideously light and infused with soul-killing muzak or corporate pop, and it's pretty much the last place you want to be, but you can't just get in and quickly out. You have to wander all over the huge overlight store confusing Azu to find the stuff you want, and you have to maneuver your junky cart through all these other tired, horrid people with carts, etc., etc., cutting stuff out because this is a long ceremony, and eventually you get all your supper supplied. Except now, it turns out there aren't enough checkout lanes open even though it's the end of the day rush. So the checkout line is incredibly long, which is stupid and infuriating, but you can't take your frustration on the frantic lady working the register who is overworked at the job, whose daily tediums and meaninglessness surpasses the imagination of any of us here at a prestigious college. But anyway, you finally get to the checkout lines front and you pay for your food, and you get told to have a nice day in a voice that is the absolute voice of death. Then you have to take your creepy flimsy plastic bags of grocery in your cart with the one crazy wheel that pulls maddeningly to the left all the way out through the crowded bumpy literal parking lot, and then you have to drive all the way home through slow, heavy, SUV intensive rush hour traffic, etc., etc. Everyone here has done this, of course, but it hasn't yet been part of your graduate actual life routine, day after week, after month, after year. But it will be a many more dreary, annoying, seemingly meaningless routine besides. But that is not the point. The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing is going to come in. Because the traffic jam and crowded aisles and long checkout lines give me time to think, and if I don't make a conscious decision about how to think and what to pay attention to, I'm going to be pissed and miserable every time I have to shop, because my natural default setting is the certainty that situations like this are really all about me, about my hungriness, about my hungriness and my fatigue and my desire to just get home. And it's going to seem for all the world like everybody else is just in my way. And who are all these people in my way? And look at how repulsive most of them are, and how stupid and cow-like and dead-eyed and non-human they seem in the checkout line, or at how annoying and rude it is that people are talking loudly on cell phones in the middle of the line, and look at how deeply and personally unfair this is. Or, of course, if I'm in a more social conscious liberal art form of my default setting, I can spend time in the end of the day traffic being disgusted about all the huge stupid lane blocking SUV and Hummers and V12 pickup truck burning their wasteful selfish 40-gallon tanks of gas, and I can dwell on the fact that the patriotic or religious bumper stickers always seems to be on the biggest, most disgustingly selfish vehicle, driven by the ugliest. This is an example of how not to think. Though most disgusting selfish vehicle driven by the ugliest, most unconsiderable. This is an example of how not to think. Though most disgusting, selfish vehicle, driven by the ugliest, most inconsiderate and aggressive drivers, and I can think about how our children's children will despise us for wasting all the future fuel and probably screwing up the climate, and how spoiled and stupid and selfish and disgusting we all are, and how modern consumer society just suck, and so forth and so on. You got the idea. If I choose to think this way in a store and on the freeway, fine. Lot of us do, except thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic that it doesn't have to be a choice. It is my natural default setting. It's the automatic way that I experience the boring, frustration, crowded part of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priority. The thing is that, of course, there are totally different ways to think about this kind of situation. In this traffic, all these vehicles stopped and idling in my way. It is not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accident in the past, and now finding driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive, or that the Hummer that just cut me off is maybe being driven by a father whose little child is hot and sick in the seat next to him, and he's trying to get this kid to the hospital, and he's in a bigger, more legitimate hurry than I am. It is actually I who is on his way. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everyone else in the supermarket checkout line is just as bored and frustrated as I am, and that some of these people probably have had more tedious and painful lives than I do. Again, please don't think that I'm giving you moral advice, or that I'm saying you are supposed to think this way, or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and effort, and if you're like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who's just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights, holding the hand of a husband who is dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicle department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends on what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and you are operating on your default settings, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to pay attention, then you will know there are other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell type situation as not only meaningful but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars, love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Not that that mystical self is necessarily true. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of real education, of learning how to be well adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship. Because here is something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trench of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship, and the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan mother goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as might, proverb, cliché, epigram, parable, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect. Being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious thing about this form of worship is not that they are evil or sinful, it's that they are unconscious, they are default setting. They are the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along in a pool of fear and anger and frustration and craving and worship of self. Our present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom all to be lord of our tiny skull-sized kingdoms, alone at the center of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it, but of course there are all different kind of freedom. And the kind that is most precious, you will not hear much talk about much in the great outside world of wanting and achieving. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad pity unsexy way every day. That is real freedom. That is being educated and understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default settings, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T, truth, with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish, but please don't just dismiss it as just some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality, or religion, or dogma, or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T, truth, is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight, all around us, all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world, day in, day out, which means yet another grand clique turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck. Thank you.